This is a paid advertisement from BetterHelp. Let's pause and take a moment to talk about something very important. Life has its pressures for everyone, and we often carry the immense weight of expectation to never show weakness, to hide our true feelings, and believe that asking for support somehow makes us less of a person. But bottling things up isn't the answer. It can often lead to feeling down, burnout, or other unhealthy habits. We want to normalize the idea that it's okay to struggle. Real strength actually comes from opening up about what you are carrying and doing something about it so that you can be at your best for yourself and everyone in your life. If you're feeling the weight of the world, or even if things just feel a bit off, I can't stress enough the value of talking to someone. It could be a friend, a loved one, or a therapist. We here at This Week Explained believe that therapy can be incredibly valuable. Whether you've been in therapy personally or not, the broader benefits are clear. It's so helpful for learning positive coping skills, understanding how to set healthy boundaries, and it really empowers you to be the best version of yourself. And it's so important to remember that therapy isn't just for those who've experienced combat or major trauma. It's a tool for anyone looking to improve their mental well-being and navigate life's challenges. That's why we're thrilled to talk about BetterHelp. With over 5,000 therapists in the UK, BetterHelp is the world's largest online therapy platform, having served over 5 million people globally. And it clearly resonates with users, boasting an App Store rating of 4.9 out of 5 stars based on over 1.7 million client reviews. It's also incredibly convenient. You can connect with a therapist at the click of a button, helping you fit therapy into your busy schedule. And you can even switch therapists at any time if you feel it's not the right fit. And here's something special for our listeners. As the largest online therapy provider in the world, BetterHelp is offering our listeners 10% off their first month. What are you waiting for? Talk it out with BetterHelp. Once again, our listeners get 10% off their first month by going to betterhelp.com/thisweek. That's BetterHelp.com/thisweek. Tired of feeling overwhelmed by the headlines? Want to truly understand the why behind the global chaos? Then you are in the right place. Welcome to This Week Explained, your weekly deep dive into the most complex and impactful stories shaping our world. I'm Tiana, and joining me, as always, is Kervin. Before we jump into the crucial developments of the week, a quick favor. If you want to ensure you never miss an episode, make sure you're following or subscribed on your podcast platform. It literally takes 2 seconds and keeps you instantly updated. And if you are getting value from what we are doing here, a simple rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify helps us reach more curious minds like yours. And don't forget the new interactive comments on Spotify. It's a fantastic way to engage directly with the show and other listeners, extending the conversation beyond the broadcast. You can also find more fantastic podcasts like ours by visiting leonmedianetwork.com, part of the awesome Leon Media Network. This week, we're diving into the latest from Ukraine and Gaza and a deep dive into the results of the NATO conference. Let's kick things off with the war in Ukraine. And Kervin, it feels like we're talking about Ukraine a lot more these days, and for good reason. The news coming out of there, especially regarding U.S. aid, is deeply concerning. This particular situation in Ukraine feels like we're watching a slow-motion train wreck. So let's start with the big picture. The U.S. hasn't announced any military aid packages for Ukraine in almost 5 months, and that's a massive gap for a country that is continuously fighting. So what's the immediate impact of that on the ground?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's absolutely massive. And Ukraine's military effectiveness is still heavily reliant on U.S. support, even though they're trying to lessen that dependence. Now, we're talking about nearly 30% of all Western military supplies, which comes from the U.S. Now, without new aid, the stockpiles in Ukrainian warehouses are rapidly dwindling, and the timing right now could not be any worse. We've got Russian troops slowly advancing, and they're gearing up for what's expected to be a major summer offensive.
And just to throw fuel on that fire, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth recently announced a cut in military aid for 2026. Coming off that long pause, that must have sent shockwaves through Kyiv.
Yeah, it really did. And it's a move that, frankly, seems to be driven by a desire for a quote-unquote peace from the Trump administration. And I put quotes up there because we don't know. I mean, we do know. They keep saying peace, and that we want peace for here and peace for this. And it always seems to be one-sided when we're talking about Russia and Ukraine. They don't really define what they mean by peace when they talk about it. Certainly not looking like they want to see justice for Ukraine right now. That's what I would say. And so this stance, whether intentional or not, absolutely undermines Ukraine's negotiating capital, and critically, it emboldens Putin to continue his aggression without real consequences. So from an analytical perspective, this is a dangerous game they're playing.
Well, what do you think will happen if it emboldens Putin to continue his aggression? Do you think eventually Trump is going to actually do something about punishing Russia if they continue it? Like once Ukraine completely runs out of all the aid that they need and all the weapons they need in order to continue their campaign, what do you think will happen if Russia continues beyond that?
It's interesting. It's something that Radio Free Europe asked in an interview I did last week. And there's not really a good answer because we just honestly don't know what Trump's going to do. A lot of people thought, right, when Israel was attacking Iran, and then the ceasefire deal was brokered, everyone just assumes that Trump loves Israel, that's the greatest U.S. ally, and he's just going to pile on Iran. And he actually seemed more angry at Israel. But that doesn't seem to be happening here with Russia and Ukraine. And so it's very, it's kind of telling as to how the administration feels towards that war. It does feel kind of one-sided to me as I'm hearing them talk about things. So what is it going to take to get Trump to stand up to Putin? I have no answer for that right now.
Okay, I guess we should bring it back to what we were discussing, which obviously this isn't the first time we've seen these kinds of pauses in aid, is it? I mean, it feels like a pattern.
Yeah, it is a pattern. This recent 5-month drought in aid announcements followed a very pointed decision by Defense Secretary Hegseth to unilaterally halt a weapons shipment to Ukraine, if you remember that from a few months ago. And this was a move that apparently blindsided the State Department, Congress, and even European allies of the United States. So the U.S. justified it as a concern over U.S. stockpiles. That's the recent word that we're getting out of this. But that was actually an excuse that was first floated by President Putin when the news broke that the U.S. was going to halt was going to halt the weapons to Ukraine. I've seen some senior military officers say that the aid that is given to Ukraine is actually not going to jeopardize U.S. supplies and stockpiles.
But it's a pretty convenient excuse. You know, you can say that. It's not like a civilian can confirm whether or not that's true.
Right.
Just looked into what the government is saying. So the rationale seems to me to be slightly disingenuous. Do you agree?
Yes and no. Obviously, the U.S. cannot restore stockpiles at the rate that aid is being sent to Ukraine, but we also expended our own weapons in the 12 Days War, and we continue to support Israel with military aid. So I would agree with you and other critics that this could be a thinly veiled attempt to cut off aid to Ukraine specifically. This was the third time Hegseth had personally stopped aid shipments. The previous 2 times alluded to before, the one in the February, so a few months ago, the one in May. But those were reversed days after. Now, it's almost as if some elements within the Pentagon, like Undersecretary Elbridge Colby, are trying to force a shift in our strategic focus away from Ukraine. And what they're probably going to say publicly is they want to counter China in the Indo-Pacific. Now, that's a valid debate to have, but I don't think it's a good debate at the expense of an active conflict.
What do you mean they are going to say that? It sounds like you don't quite believe that's what's going on. Can you say anything about that, or should I just skip that question?
No, I'll say some stuff. It goes back to being disingenuous, right? And it goes back to Israel. And you know how when I talk about Israel, it's a key U.S. ally. Ukraine is not a U.S. ally. They're not known as a U.S. ally. We're helping Ukraine because Russia is an adversary to the United States. Yes, Russia is an adversary to the United States. But when you talk about we need to stop aid to Ukraine, stop aiding Ukraine in an active conflict, and yet we expend millions to billions of dollars in munitions to support Israel that went on the offensive against Iran. I'm not saying that was right or wrong. My personal opinion is that Israel did the right thing because after looking at stuff, Iran was very close to having a nuclear or the capabilities of creating a nuclear weapon, and that was going to be aimed directly at Israel. So I felt like Israel did need to do that. But there were no talks of, well, let's not support Israel because of stockpiles. It was Israel's doing this. They've asked for our support, and we're going to do it. So that's why I agree with you somewhat that it's a little disingenuous. And when they say that they're countering China in the Indo-Pacific, if that's the case, then why are you taking naval assets from the Indo-Pacific, some of our top naval assets, and shifting them from the Indo-Pacific into the Central Command in the Middle East, and you're using it to help Israel? That's something that China probably wants to see happen so that they can make a move for Taiwan. And now those assets that would have been there already have to make that trip back. We're not at the point where we can just, move pieces like this is a chessboard and you can do it really quickly. It's going to take time. And the more time it takes, the easier it is for China to take over Taiwan. So that's what I was saying. I was trying to think about how I can say that without giving up too much. But
okay. So I'm guessing you succeeded in that. It's not like
yes,
I will know. Okay. So the White House's defense of these decisions, saying it's part of an ongoing review, does that hold water given this pattern that they've displayed over the last few months?
Again, I think it's a weak defense. So, look, these reviews are standard, but the timing, the unilateral nature of the halts, and the consistent reversal of these decisions suggest more is at play than just routine assessment of the stockpiles. The fact that some of these weapons were already loaded on trucks in Poland, they were ready for delivery, that only adds to the sense of disarray. And if I could just say one more thing on, these are stockpiles. A lot of these weapons are going to go out of commission probably before we even get into a conflict with China. So they need to be expended. Why not give it to Ukraine so that they can do it for peace, right? To push back an aggressor.
This just sounds like government stuff to me. Now, not a clear decision. They're not all communicating with each other. They all have different ideas on how this should go, and it just no one, they can't come up with a uniform decision.
Yeah, and it sounds like government speak to you because it is. I mean, that is exactly what's going on, and it's the reason nothing gets done.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds typical that the weapons would be there already, and then they would still decide to withhold them, just based, I guess we need some decommissioned weapons in our fight with China. So.
Yeah, I mean, use them for exercises, I guess.
Well, speaking of disarray, let's talk about President Trump's 2-week deadline for Russia to show it was serious about peace. That deadline came and went, and what we saw was the complete opposite of peace because Putin has been emboldened.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's almost as if Putin wants more than a special military operation, doesn't it, Tiana? So it's been over a month since that May 28th statement of 2 weeks to have peace in this conflict. And since then, not only has Russia declined to stop attacking Ukraine, it's actually escalated its attacks on civilians. And it's escalated to unprecedented levels. We've seen 2 record-breaking drone attacks since that deadline. The number of drones launched in June is nearly doubled the highest monthly total, which was March. And this isn't a sign of peace. And I want to call it what it is. This is terrorism against a civilian population.
And the White House's response to this escalation or lack thereof, because it seems like once again Trump did his whole bluff and bluster thing, and nothing came of it.
Yeah, and I don't. I mean, we do take both sides, right? When somebody does something
Right.
and we view that in a good way, we will give them praise for that. I think this is a podcast episode where people are going to hear me keep harping on Trump in a negative way because of the Israel-Iran conflict. And so what was the response from the U.S. to Russia's escalation? It was crickets. There were no F-bombs. There was no condemnation. There were no new sanctions. In fact, Trump actually excused Russia's escalating attacks by saying Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb, which was the military strike on Russian bombers, that gave Putin a reason to go in and bomb the hell out of them. I'm sorry, but that is a morally bankrupt justification for what Russia is doing. Russia is indiscriminately targeting Ukrainian civilians.
And because no one is saying anything to Putin about him being naughty, what is the message that sends to Putin or to any adversary for that matter?
Yeah, I mean, the message to me seems clear. There are no real consequences for escalating violence. Putin has very little incentive to stop right now. If anything, this kind of inaction from the United States, combined with the aid pauses, that only reinforces Putin's theory of victory. He thinks and he understands that Russia can win a war of attrition by simply outlasting Western support for Ukraine. We've seen this before. Previous delays in U.S. aid have invariably led to Russian advances on the battlefield, and it's a dangerous feedback loop.
I'm pretty sure you've mentioned that this was possibly the long game that Russia was playing from the beginning of this conflict. Mm-hmm. They were, waiting for the president to change and waiting for sentiments to change, knowing that any sort of prolonged conflict, I mean, obviously it's going to start out where everybody was backing Ukraine, but now as it goes on, everyone's moved on to the next issue. They're tired of hearing about it, where everybody's so detached and desensitized because of everything that's going on. So now we've moved on to the next thing, which currently in the United States of America is that heartbreaking occurrence that happened in Texas during that storm. So with U.S. aid in question and Russian attacks intensifying, what are Ukraine's options? They can't just sit there.
Yeah, they can't, and they're not. Ukraine is doing everything it can to prepare for the worst. Now, their European partners are stepping up a bit. There's an initiative called Rearm Europe plan. It's an $800 billion effort to boost Europe's defense capabilities and to support Ukraine. But studies show that Europe isn't yet ready to fully replace U.S. aid. It requires a massive and decisive increase in their own defense spending. And we're going to get into that increase in defense spending, I think, at the end of this episode when we talk about NATO.
This is something that needs to happen anyways, so I'm glad they're finally saying, yeah, we probably need to step up and quit relying so heavily on U.S. stockpiles. So internally, what are they doing?
Well, Ukraine is pushing hard on domestic military production. I already talked about, I went on Radio for Europe a few days ago, and I kind of said that while this is terrible news, there are some positives to take from it because of Ukraine's domestic production. They've been able to handle domestically doing some of their own missile production, and Zelensky announced plans to increase their own weapon supplies. He wants to increase the supplies to the army from 40% to 50% this year. The Ukraine's prime minister even stated they'd be 100% self-sufficient in artillery by the end of the year. That's incredible to think about. A nation at war for so long can get to 100% self-sufficient in artillery by the end of the year. And then,
I mean, artillery's pretty simple compared to like drones and long range missiles and stuff like that. I mean, we went into a house where a guy was producing his own.
Yeah,
Not
we
gonna
won't
say
get
it. I'm not
into
gonna
that
say
one.
where or with who, but we were looking for houses and we went into this guy's basement. It was obvious he didn't want us to go in the basement, but if we're looking at your house to buy it, I'm walking in your basement. And
Nope.
I
He shouldn't have had that on the market.
yeah, well, he should have at least stored his stuff elsewhere, but it was wild. He just had canisters and canisters just filled with it, and he was packing it in his basement. For what? I don't know. Zombie apocalypse, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it was a prepper's dream for
Right. Well,
for real.
it even included cats, lots of cats.
Lots of cats.
There
Yep.
were lots of cats, and lots of bullets. Okay. Anyway, so
Yeah, but we're getting back to how Ukraine is doing similar to what this guy was doing, which is domestically producing their own weapons to stop aggressive governments, I'm guessing. Um, just, I don't know for a fact that's what he was doing, but it seemed that way. Think about where we stand right now after the special military operation started, right? So Putin claimed he wanted to deter NATO, he wanted to demilitarize Ukraine, and all he's done since 2022 is make NATO stronger. So Sweden and Finland joined, and they're stronger without U.S. support, mind you. He's also made Ukraine's military self-sustaining, not demilitarized. So it's incredible. Ukraine's drone program is fundamentally changing the battlefield. Plus, Ukrainian specialists are now capable of repairing American weapons without that assistance from the United States. And that's a big deal for keeping equipment in the fight.
So they're becoming more self-reliant, but is there still a critical gap that only the U.S. can fill? And that's what everybody's kind of worried about.
Yeah, there is. There's a huge one. It's the Patriot air defense system. Ukraine's armed forces might be able to manage without some American weapons, but their cities absolutely cannot manage without the Patriot air defense system. Europe is still in the early stages of mass producing similar systems. The Patriot is a game changer for intercepting ballistic missiles, and without it, Ukrainian cities are going to face even more unimaginable suffering.
And then there's the intelligence aspect, which often goes unsaid, but is obviously vital.
Yeah, exactly. U.S. intelligence cooperation has been deeply ingrained in Ukraine for years. It's been helping Ukraine monitor missile launches and identify targets for long-range strikes. So while European partners can eventually provide some of this, replacing American intelligence fully would require immense resources, time, and crucially, political will.
We've talked about the strategic implications, the political maneuvering, the numbers, but what always strikes me is the human cost. We've seen enough conflict in our lives to know what it means for the people on the ground.
Yeah, that's the families living under constant bombardment. The fear that never disappears until the air raid siren stops. It's the despair of seeing residential buildings and cultural sites just absolutely flattened. And as someone who's seen the immediate aftermath of a conflict zone, this isn't just about geopolitics anymore. It's about real people. It's about their lives and their homes, their futures being shattered. So the idea that this is all part of some negotiating strategy and civilians are just pawns in that, it really is heartbreaking.
Seems to be a running theme in all the current conflicts going on right now. The civilians are the pawns, the expendable pieces. It makes these tough geopolitical conversations we have so real. The lack of consistent, robust support from a key ally like the U.S. isn't just a policy decision, it's a direct impact on the lives of millions of innocent people.
Yeah, exactly. And it gives Putin every reason to believe that if he waits long enough, he's going to win this war. And for Ukraine, this is not just a setback. This is potentially a disaster.
A sobering thought, but one we will continue talking about until peace is truly achieved in Ukraine. But it is not the only conflict finding it difficult to achieve peace. While the world watches the unfolding tragedy there, our attention is also drawn to another devastating conflict that has captured global headlines. Dozens of hostages remain in captivity, millions of civilians are displaced, and the violence from both a democratic government and a terrorist organization has opinions flying all across the board. Obviously, I am talking about the war in Gaza. Another week, Another set of developments on a potential Gaza ceasefire. So, what is the latest?
Well, at least this week, we're witnessing some genuinely significant movement in the efforts to secure peace in Gaza. There was a major development over the weekend, where Hamas officially gave a positive response to the latest U.S. brokered proposal for a 60-day ceasefire. We're not just talking about more of the same, where the two sides are trying to delay peace efforts for their own gain. This positive response has already prompted action. Israel dispatched a negotiating team to Qatar so that they can discuss further the proposal that's being pushed out. But it's also not without its complexities. With all that said, Israel has also indicated that some of Hamas's requested changes to the proposal are, quote, unacceptable, end quote.
I mean, a positive response is good, but, quote, ready for negotiations, end quote, isn't quite a full acceptance, is it? So what exactly does this proposal entail?
Yeah, you are absolutely right to pick up on that distinction. Ready for negotiations is far different from acceptance. It's a positive start, but it's not a done deal. Now, the proposal itself was pretty clear. It has a staggered release of 28 hostages. That's 10 living and 18 deceased hostages over a 60-day period. For instance, 8 living hostages would be released on day 1 in exchange for an unspecified number of Palestinian prisoners. Now, in return, Israel would partially withdraw from northern Gaza, and critically, humanitarian aid would surge into the Gaza Strip.
Okay, so what about from the Hamas side?
So Hamas's key amendments revolve around a few things here. First, they want a U.S. guarantee that hostilities are not going to resume if talks on a permanent ceasefire fail. So from their perspective...
But no one can, like, getting a guarantee from the United States. Israel doesn't listen. They do what they want. It doesn't matter what we guarantee. They're still going to do what they want to do.
From the Hamas side, it would be that the United States guarantees that they would not support Israel, so they would halt aid, they would halt funding if Israel breaks the ceasefire, or if the ceasefire fails or the hostilities start back up before a permanent ceasefire can be agreed to.
Oh, okay. But that won't happen either, so.
Well, yes, okay. I'm just trying to give you what should happen. It never happens this way in real life, right? Especially when we're talking Middle East and what the U.S. does with Israel, right? Now, Hamas also wants humanitarian aid distributed exclusively by the UN and its partners. They want to end the role of the Israeli and U.S.-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And for those who listen to the podcast every week, first up, thank you for that. But this probably doesn't surprise you because we discussed this last week, why Hamas wants the UN to take back aid distribution, right? They want the funding that they get from stealing the aid and selling it to the Palestinian people. And lastly, Hamas is pushing for Israeli troops to return to positions they held before the last ceasefire collapsed in March. They're very wary right now of new corridors Israel has established.
I remember you talking about that last week, that Hamas was actually gaining financially from taking UN aid and demanding Palestinians pay to receive that aid. So, as I said in the transition to this topic, opinions are flying out on both sides, with people pointing fingers based solely on their bias towards one group or another. But here's something I think both sides of those opinions would agree on. Let's find a sustainable, tangible peace in the region. So, can you answer this question? Will the fighting truly stop?
Yeah, I mean, the devil's in the details, right? And the trust or lack thereof between both parties there, Israel and Hamas. Now, for Israel's part, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been very clear. He said the war won't end until all hostages are released and Hamas's military and governing capabilities are destroyed. That's a very high bar. It directly clashes with Hamas's demand for a permanent cessation of hostilities. There is still a fundamental disconnect that these negotiations are trying to bridge between the two parties.
So, where does the U.S. stand in all of this? President Trump has been quite vocal.
He has. He's also been very optimistic. He said a deal could be reached as early as next week, and he's urged Hamas to accept the final proposal. He's even warned them it will, quote, not get better, it will only get worse, end quote. So that's a strong push from the U.S. This is a significant factor in getting the ceasefire agreed to. In fact, some sources suggest that Trump's tough stance on Israel regarding the Iran ceasefire actually gave Hamas a bit more confidence that the U.S. would guarantee any future deal and prevent a return to fighting. So this is a unique dynamic at play.
I'm glad you brought that up because after the recent Israel-Iran conflict, it seems there's a renewed sense of urgency. But even with all of this diplomatic effort, the conflict on the ground hasn't stopped, has it?
No, not at all. That just while these negotiations unfold, the Israeli military continues its operations across Gaza. The Hamas-run health ministries reported over 57,000 Palestinians killed since the war began, and hundreds more in just the past few days from continued strikes.
Well, what about the pressure from their own people on both sides? Are we seeing a renewed demand to end this conflict?
Yeah, we absolutely are. In Israel, the families of the remaining hostages, they're holding rallies. They're desperately urging for a deal that brings everyone home. They are a very powerful voice in Israel. I mean, we've talked about what it's like to have a loved one in harm's way, waiting for the news. It's unimaginable for these families. And on the other side, you have the immense civilian toll in Gaza. That is fueling calls for an end to the carnage. Palestinians are turning on Hamas, and they're demanding an end to this war and a new government.
But I also read that within Israel, Netanyahu faces internal challenges from his far-right coalition partners who view any ceasefire as surrender and a betrayal of the war's objectives.
Yeah, it's this constant disconnect between governments and the people that they are supposed to serve, right? So some within the Israeli government are dead set against stopping the war without what they consider a decisive victory. They want to have the parade, show victory. This internal political dynamic is a major obstacle for Netanyahu and the Israeli people. There are reports that if the more right-wing parties were to quit, we'd see some centrist parties step in to support an actual ceasefire deal. That could provide Netanyahu with the political cover he needs to agree to this. Now, he's also in the United States right now. He's meeting with Trump in Washington, D.C., and I think that's going to be the top conversation on the docket. It's going to be very critical to hear what happened during those conversations.
So, to summarize, we have a positive but conditional response from Hamas, a U.S.-backed proposal with specific terms for hostage release and aid, and ongoing intense military operations. The diplomatic push is strong, especially from President Trump, but significant hurdles remain, particularly on the duration of the ceasefire and the end of the war, and, of course, the domestic politics on both sides.
Yeah, good. You nailed the summary there. I really appreciate that, just breaking it down after we spent about 25 minutes going back and forth on that. I will say we're seeing a genuine window of opportunity, perhaps the most promising in months, but the complexities of these negotiations, coupled with the grim realities on the ground and the intense political pressures, means that nothing is certain until the ink is dry.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even the most well-intentioned diplomacy is a fragile thing in the face of such deep-seated conflict. We'll be keeping an eye on this as always, so thank you, Kerbin, for breaking that down for us. Now, let's move to the Northern Atlantic, or I guess I should say the Northern Atlantic Treaty Organization, which just wrapped up 2 whirlwind days at the NATO summit in The Hague. But first, we need to take a quick break for a message from our sponsors, so stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back, listeners. As I said at the break, NATO just wrapped up 2 whirlwind days at The Hague. The Dutch called it their biggest security operation ever, and for good reason. From our perspective, having now done this podcast for almost 4 years, 4 years. Sorry, that's
Just leave it at that.
yeah, we'll just leave it at that. And we've seen countless geopolitical shifts. This one does feel a little bit different, though, doesn't it? Like, what is your top takeaway from this summit?
Yes, my biggest takeaway is something that we've discussed on this podcast over 4 years, and that is the commitment to a 5% GDP defense spending target for all allies within NATO. And they want it to be reached within a decade. So think about that. 5%. That's up from the 2% guideline that NATO has pushed since 2006. That's a remarkable jump. And frankly, we both agree. We've said this many times on the podcast. It's long overdue.
Right, because we were covering it for all the other countries that didn't want to meet that. 5%. That's a figure not seen since the Cold War. And it's a huge ask, especially considering 8 out of 32 members aren't even hitting the 2% mark right now. So how realistic is this, and what does that 5% really mean?
Yeah, it really is ambitious for NATO. Think of this, the U.S., they've been pushing for this since the return of the Trump administration, but we currently spend 3.4% of GDP. And domestically, President Trump wants less and more efficient defense spending. So how does everyone get to 5%? I think the key is the breakdown. You've got 3.5% for core defense. That's troops and weapons. I think most of them can get to that 3.5%. And so that's the real goal here. Now, the other 1.5% is defense-related expenditure. Now, that's a broader term. You got cyber, infrastructure. They also tab innovation within that figure. This is the flexible part of all of this. So a country could count domestic tech spending as part of this 1.5% in defense-related expenditure. It's not strictly military. But look, make no mistake, hitting that 3.5% core target is going to be a huge stretch for many of those countries that you talked about. Don't even hit the 2% mark right now. There is also accountability. I like that part or that aspect of this. There are annual plans, and there is a major review in 2029. So we're not just talking about NATO's talking about it. This is a strategic shift for the alliance.
So they're going to, in 2029, review how much GDP is being spent towards defense?
Yeah, make sure that each country is on the trajectory within the decade. Yeah.
So they have to have an active plan in place by 2029 and proof that they are trying to reach the goal.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, speaking of accountability, let's talk about Article 5, which is NATO's bedrock principle of collective defense. And after President Trump's past comments questioning it, there was certainly some apprehension heading into this summit. So what is the verdict there?
Yeah, look, that was a crucial point. We were all waiting to hear what their response was. And honestly, the response was a relief. The summit agreement explicitly reaffirmed, and I'll quote them here, our ironclad commitment to a collective defense, end quote. Trump himself even publicly stated, quote, I stand with Article 5. That's why I'm here, end quote. These are all positives for the alliance. Now, for countries on the front line, particularly those bordering Russia, that reassurance is vital. And it's a win for Trump, too. He's returning to Washington, D.C. He's got an agreement that all allies are going to up their contributions. So this is a classic burden-sharing move. And in my view, this is a healthy rebalancing of NATO.
And this commitment to Article 5, coupled with the increased spending, feels like NATO is really going, quote, back to its roots, end quote, as a deterrent. As Finnish President Alexander Stubb put it. He even called it the, quote, birth of a more European NATO, end quote. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And I also think it's a thinly veiled dig at the United States. So if you read between the lines here, well, actually, you can read it in the quote itself. A more European NATO. NATO is basically saying the U.S. isn't the ally it once was, and we need to plan our future around that. So for years, U.S. administrations have called for Europe to do more of its own defense, and then they haven't done it. So this commitment to 5% defense spending, coupled with renewed focus on collective security in the face of Russian aggression, that signifies a shift. Now, while it's not about the U.S. pulling away entirely, this is a rebalancing within the alliance where Europe takes on a greater share of the responsibility. And I think the years ahead with NATO, with Europe, it's going to be quite interesting.
All right, let's pivot to the Russia question. Given Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine, I imagine it was a thorny issue, especially with President Trump's generally softer approach to Moscow. But how did the summit declaration address Russia and the conflict?
It was definitely an area of careful navigation. Last year's declaration used very strong language condemning Russia's, quote, brutal war of aggression, end quote. But this time, the statement did mention the, quote, long-term threat posed by Russia to Euro-Atlantic security, end quote, and it reaffirmed the need for, quote, enduring support to Ukraine, end quote. There is not a specific direct condemnation of Russia in the communique itself. It's a compromise that likely reflects the need to get consensus from all members, and that main member is the United States.
So, a more generalized concern about Russia rather than direct blame for the war. And what about support for Ukraine? Finnish President Stubb emphasized that Europeans need to pick up the slack with the U.S. halting some weapon shipments.
Yeah, as I said during the Ukraine discussion at the beginning of the podcast, Europe is going to need to pick up the slack here. That's because the U.S. is creating gaps in that aid. We're already seeing this happen. Got countries that have borders touching Russia. They are especially getting involved with more support to Ukraine because they believe they're next. Poland, for instance, sent a delegation to include its president to Ukraine to discuss how Poland can help to deter Russia from being even more aggressive. Now, for NATO as a whole, they have outlined two crucial ways to help Ukraine. Continue to provide Ukraine with the weapons it needs to win on the battlefield, and also increase pressure on Russia through more sanctions. They also offered a pragmatic two-phase approach to peace talks. First, they need a ceasefire. Then the actual peace negotiations covering territorial settlements, compensation, and reconstruction can happen. You can't lump it all together and expect to get progress here.
Well, it sounds like a lot of tough, serious conversations, but were there any moments of levity amid the gravitas? I heard something about a golf game and even daddy issues.
Yeah, there were certainly a few, as is common with President Trump in attendance. Trump's golf game with Finnish President Stubb, that was one thing. They talked about everything from Ukraine to the Finnish icebreakers, which are the ships used in the Arctic and the Northern Sea, so other ships can pass through frozen waters. Apparently, Trump loves these ships, and he's keen on the U.S. acquiring more of them. And that's given Russia's vast fleet and the strategic importance of the Arctic. Now, Finnish President Stubb even offered to provide some of these, perhaps selling a used one and building new ones for Finland. Just one of those moments that just goes to show how geopolitics, this is a lot like running a corporate business.
Okay, so what about the daddy issues? I know I'm curious, and I'm sure some of our listeners want to know about that one as well.
Yeah, that was quite a moment. So this is where it happened. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, he's going to be stepping down soon, but he had quite a unique exchange with President Donald Trump. He had previously flattered Trump in a private message about his decisive action in Iran. And Trump, in his own Trump way, publicly shared that interaction. But then in a joint appearance, when Trump described the Israel-Iran situation as, this is Trump's words, quote, like two kids in a schoolyard, end quote, Rutte responded, quote, and then daddy has to sometimes use strong language to get them to stop, end quote. And Trump was quite amused by this comment. Marco Rubio was even seen kind of like a Saturday Night Live episode where they break during the entire sketch. He was laughing in the background. So it was kind of an unconventional display of diplomacy. There was even a question from the media about asking Trump how he felt being called daddy by the NATO Secretary General. I think it brings some levity, and it just shows that we are all just human, all of our flaws and our good parts.
Well, I just think it's funny that that's the context they placed on Trump saying the F word, by the way. Okay. I like
yes.
That's pretty funny. But calling him daddy, that's kind of creepy too, in a way. So obviously the whole interaction was unconventional. And then there was Spain. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez seemed to have a particularly rough time with Trump publicly accusing Spain of seeking a, quote, free ride on defense spending.
Yeah, Sanchez was definitely in the hot seat, and that's because Spain props up the bottom of the NATO spending. They are at 1.24%. They spend the least on GDP for defense spending. Now, the Prime Minister of Spain insisted that 2.1% was sufficient and that Spain could get there, but Trump was not having any of it. Even threatened to impose higher tariffs on Spain. That's his favorite thing to do now, is just say he's going to impose higher tariffs to get people to do what he wants them to do. Now, that's going to be quite difficult because of Spain's EU membership, but Sanchez appeared quite isolated in the end of the summit NATO family photo, so he definitely looked like he was being pushed out a bit.
So looking ahead, what's the biggest takeaway for you from this summit? Like, what does it signal for the future of global security?
I think, first of all, it signals a more mature, more self-reliant Europe within NATO. That's spurred by the stark realities of the war in Ukraine and the shifting geopolitical landscape. I think the invasion has shaken Europe, and they are now more focused on the future. Now, for us, having been affected by conflicts, this commitment to deterrence and defense, I think it's crucial. I think this is why when we talk about NATO not doing its part, and I'm talking about you and me, Tiana, this comes from a perspective that sees what happens when you go to war with the army you have and not necessarily the one that you need.
That was Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, wasn't it? The man who famously said, quote, "You go to war with the army you have," end quote. And he said it just a few months after you guys were literally Mad Maxing Humvees in Kuwait for protection on the road to Baghdad. The pure weight of that in that moment says it all. So is there anything else you want to discuss?
I think that's it on my end. Do you have anything you want to talk about?
No.
Okay, good.
Thank you for listening to This Week Explained. We hope that you found it both informative and engaging. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, we would love to hear from you. For more in-depth coverage of these stories and more, be sure to follow us on social media at This Week Explained.
Tiana, thank you so much. Until next week, stay safe out there.